Theodore Geisel, known as Dr. Seuss by most Americans, wasn't just the children's author that we think of him as. It wasn't even a vocation he considered. As a boy in Springfield, Massachusetts, he developed a love of designing complicated contraptions from his father, and a love of poetry from his mother. For a time, Ted's father worked as superintendent of the Springfield Zoo, and Ted would take his sketchbook to the zoo and draw the animals. Throughout high school and college, he wrote and drew cartoons for his school's newspapers and literary magazines. It was at Dartmouth that he started using the pen name Seuss, pronounced like his mother's maiden name. The doctor came later. He went to Oxford after graduating from Dartmouth, and it was there that he decided to give up on the idea of becoming an English professor and try to build a career as a cartoonist and illustrator. Back home in Springfield, he sent cartoons to dozens of magazines, until he finally sold a cartoon to Saturday Evening Post for $25. Ted Geisel decided that this signaled success, and moved to New York to pursue his career. Judge magazine, as well as Life and the Saturday Evening Post, used many of his drawings and cartoons, but he also built a lucrative advertising career. In 1927, Standard Oil Company noticed that Dr. Seuss had used one of their products, Flit, in his cartoons. They hired him, and his slogan, "Quick Henry, the Flit," became a very common phrase. In 1937, Dr. Seuss wrote his first book, originally titled A Story That No One Could Beat. It was rejected by 27 publishing companies. One day, while walking the streets of New York, ready to give up on this book, he ran into a college buddy who had just become a children's editor for a random house. His friend suggested that he change the name of the book to "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street." The book immediately became a bestseller. Over the next few years, he wrote several more children's books, including Horton Hatches the Egg. In 1941, Ted Geisel showed a cartoon to one of the owners of PM Magazine, a liberal political tabloid in New York City. The cartoon was about a fascist Italian newspaper editor named Virginio Gaeta. PM Magazine hired him as their chief political cartoonist, a job he held until 1943. The 400 cartoons he created for PM took potshots at such issues as inflation, taxes, racism, anti-Semitism, and the war effort. An organization he was strongly opposed to was the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh and several influential Republican congressmen were part of this group, which opposed America's involvement in the war. They were anti-Semitic and somewhat racist. Dr. Seuss portrayed them as ostriches who put their heads in the sand rather than see what was actually happening. He strongly believed that if America listened to the America First Committee, our country could be Hitler's next victim. Some of Ted's PM cartoons promoted buying war stocks and bonds. This was the major way that the United States financed World War II. From his youth on, he had always believed that a little humor mixed in with a more serious issue was a better way to get people's attention than just stating the facts. Many of Geisel's wartime cartoons, especially those targeting the Japanese, would today be considered racist, but they reflected the mindset of the United States at this time. This open prejudice seems out of character for the Dr. Seuss we know in his children's books. Then, in 1943, Ted felt that he owed his country some service, but he was too old for the Army, so he decided to join the Army Signal Corps. He was stationed in Hollywood, California, at the 20th Century Fox studio lot, which is called Fort Fox by the Signal Corps. Ted's job was to create films and pamphlets that were used to instruct and train soldiers. One of Ted's creations was Private Snafu. Snafu was a klutz in the army that always messed up everything he did. Ted created 28 different Snafu cartoons to show the men in the army what not to do. The gold brick showed how laziness and irresponsibility can affect the war, while rumors taught the importance of keeping some information quiet. Snafuperman shows what can happen when someone doesn't plan his strategies for action. The army had created technical manuals to teach soldiers how to avoid illnesses and other dangers, but these books were a failure. Nobody paid much attention to them. So Ted and another children's book writer, Monroe Leaf, were commissioned to create a humorous booklet to warn soldiers about the dangers of malaria, a deadly disease that was carried by mosquitoes. Unlike most of the military booklets, Dr. Seuss added a humorous twist to This Is Anne. This was one of the many pieces of information, written and filmed, that he composed to inform soldiers in an interesting way. In 1945, Geisel created two major films that were used to inform soldiers about the post-war. One, titled Your Job in Germany, was about how the Germans could not be trusted. War, fake peace, war, fake peace. The German history book repeated itself always. This was the main message that Ted tried to get across in this film. The other film that he composed was entitled Our Job in Japan. This film was aimed towards soldiers about to enter Japan to participate in the Allied occupation after World War II. These two films were the base for two later movies. Hitler Lives, released in 1945, was based off of Your Job in Germany. Designed for Death, released in 1947, was based off of Our Job in Japan. Both movies used much of their original footage in their reproductions. After the war, Dr. Seuss returned to writing his beloved children's books that he had put aside for the past 7 years. He began to write his early reader books, but for some of his other books, he used his writing as a vehicle to get out his messages about racism, protecting the earth, and lessons from history. In 1951, Dr. Seuss visited Japan and observed the changes resulting from the American occupation of Japan following World War II. The Japanese people had a new government, a new educational system, and were preparing to vote for the first time. Seuss was struck by the idea that the Japanese people were finally having the opportunity to have a voice in their country, and how important that was. From those thoughts, Horton Hears a Who was created, with the folks from Whoville representing the people of Japan, because a person is a person, no matter how small. Yertle the Turtle was written in 1958. Dr. Seuss had stated that the character, King Yertle, represented Adolf Hitler, with Yertle's dictator rule of the pond and takeover of the surrounding area being just like Hitler's rule of Germany and his invasion of various parts of Europe. Originally, Yertle even had a mustache, but Dr. Seuss decided that it was a little too obvious. The Sneetches, created in 1961, took on racism and anti-Semitism and drove home the point that appearance should not matter. In 1971, Dr. Seuss created one of his favorite books, The Lorax, which showed how important it is to take care of the environment. The Pulitzer Prize-winning Butter Battle book was published in 1984. This book, which parodied the Cold War, told the tale of two cities fighting each other about which way they should butter their bread. It showed how trivial the Cold War was. The Cat in the Hat, one of Dr. Seuss's most famous books, has sold more than 10.5 million copies in its classic edition alone. He wrote over 40 great books during his life. Also, Ted's books have been published in 20 different languages, with over 250 million copies sold worldwide. Most of us only know Dr. Seuss through the books he has written, but the influence goes so much further than that. His advertising affected the products that American people bought. He shaped the attitudes of the soldiers through his Signal Corps movies that he made. He inspired patriotism through advertising war bonds, but most importantly, he addressed every issue, regardless how serious, with a hint of humor.